She had exactly $32.18 left in the world. A foreclosure notice was pinned to her door like a tombstone for 3 generations of Montgomery history, and a legacy nursery that was slowly turning to dust. Then came the hurricane, the kind of storm that makes the trees in Savannah scream. And with it came a knock. A drenched stranger in a blue denim shirt, holding his shivering daughter in his arms. She should have kept that door locked. God knows she had enough of her own problems to drown in. But something made her open it anyway. "Come in, quick," she whispered, extending a beige towel. What happened next is the kind of story people beg me to tell again and again, because every single woman watching right now who feels like she's at her breaking point needs to hear how this ends. So, do me a favor real quick. Hit that like button right now so this reaches every sister who is tired, holding it all together, and still choosing kindness when the world gives her nothing back. Let's get this to 1 million likes for Willow. Drop "I'm ready" in the comments if you're still here with me. And don't you dare move because this one hits different. The night Willow Montgomery's world changed forever, she had exactly $32.18 to her name. The foreclosure notice had arrived that morning, a cold, jagged reminder that in 48 hours, her family's botanical heritage would be bulldozed for a tech hub. 48 hours. That's all she had left before the land her grandfather tilled became another parking lot. 48 hours to find a miracle she didn't believe in anymore. The grief burned in her chest as she looked at her long dark braids in the mirror, pulling them back into a tight ponytail. She'd done everything right. She'd spent years perfecting her craft as a botanical artist, learning the secret language of healing herbs, and keeping the nursery alive when the economy tried to kill it. For a decade, Montgomery Greens had been a sanctuary. People traveled for her rare lilies and her soul-healing teas. Then the developers came. And the man leading the charge? He was the very one she just let into her home to escape the rain. The thunder didn't just growl. It vibrated through the very soles of Willow's feet, shaking the ancient floorboards of the Montgomery farmhouse, as if the earth itself were trying to break inside. Outside, the Savannah sky had turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the wind whipped the Spanish moss into frenzied gray ghosts. Willow stood in the narrow hallway, the beige towel in her hand already damp from the spray of the storm. She looked at the man standing in her foyer, this stranger in a soaked blue denim shirt, and then at the small, trembling girl huddled against his side. The man's dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, dark and sharp despite his obvious exhaustion, scanned the room with a wary, protective intensity. But it was the girl who caught Willow's breath. Wrapped in a pink hooded jacket that was now several shades darker from the rain, she looked smaller than she probably was. Her eyes were wide, glazed with a glassy sheen that Willow recognized instantly. It wasn't just fear. It was a fever that was beginning to bake her from the inside out. "Please," the man said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the roar of the rain on the tin roof. "She's burning up. We were trying to get to the city, but the roads, the trees are down everywhere." Willow didn't hesitate. The foreclosure notice on the front door was still fresh in her mind. A paper-thin reminder that her own life was falling apart, but the heat radiating off the child was a more urgent reality. She reached out, her long dark braids swaying as she guided them toward the kitchen, the heart of the home where the smell of dried lavender and rich, damp earth always lingered. "Set her down here," Willow commanded softly, gesturing to the sturdy oak table that had seen 3 generations of Montgomery women through their own storms. As the man eased the girl onto a chair, Willow moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent her life listening to the rhythm of nature. She touched the girl's forehead, her skin warm and dark against the child's pale, flushed cheek. The heat was alarming. "Her name is Yuna," the man said, his hands hovering near the girl's shoulders as if he were afraid she might vanish if he let go. "I'm Min-jun." Willow nodded, though the names felt secondary to the task at hand. "I'm Willow, and Yuna is in good hands, Min-jun. But we need to move fast. That's no ordinary chill she's caught. She turned to her workbench, where jars of dried petals, roots, and tinctures were lined up like soldiers. To anyone else, it might have looked like a collection of weeds, but to Willow it was a pharmacy of the earth. She reached for a small, opaque ceramic jar tucked away in the back, the one she only touched when the situation was dire. Inside were the dried petals of the midnight lily. Getty Images. The midnight lily was a Montgomery family secret, a rare hybrid her grandfather had cultivated in the deepest, darkest corner of their nursery. It bloomed only under the moon and possessed a cooling property that could draw a fever out of a body like a sponge soaked up water. It was the last of her supply, precious, irreplaceable, and exactly what this little girl needed. She set a copper kettle on the stove, the flame casting a warm, flickering orange light against her tan V-neck shirt. As the water began to hum, Willow crushed the silver-flecked petals into a fine powder, the scent filling the kitchen. A mix of cool mint and deep, sweet vanilla. "What is that?" Minjun asked, his voice tighter now. He was watching her every move, his posture stiff, the muscles in his jaw working. He looked like a man used to being in control, now forced to rely on a woman he didn't know in a house that was technically on the verge of being stolen from her. "It's medicine," Willow replied, her voice steady and calm, the soulful tone she used to quiet the nerves of her plants. "It's a tea from a very special lily. It doesn't just mask the fever. It talks to the body. It tells it to let the heat go." She poured the steaming water over the powder, watching as the liquid turned a vibrant, glowing indigo. She added a drop of wild honey and a pinch of crushed willow bark for the pain. When she brought the cup over, the steam curled around Yuna's face, and for a second, the little girl's eyes fluttered open. "Drink this, sweetheart," Willow whispered, holding the cup to Yuna's lips. "It's going to feel like a cool breeze on a hot July day." Yuna hesitated, looking up at her father. Minjun searched Willow's eyes. He saw the strength there, the quiet dignity of a woman who had nothing left to lose and yet was giving away her most valuable treasure to a stranger. He nodded slowly. With a shaky hand, Yuna took a sip, then another. The bitter sweetness of the midnight lily seemed to settle into her almost instantly. Willow took the beige towel, soaked it in cool well water, and began to gently dab Yuna's neck and wrists, talking to her in a low, rhythmic hum. A story about the flowers that grew in the dark and how they weren't afraid of the shadows. Minutes stretched into an hour. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling like a wounded animal. But inside the kitchen, the atmosphere began to shift. The frantic, jagged energy of Minjun's arrival began to smooth out. He sat across from Willow, his blue denim shirt starting to dry, his eyes never leaving his daughter. "You have a gift," he said quietly, looking around at the botanical sketches pinned to the walls. Intricate, soulful renderings of plants that looked like they might breathe if you touched them. "These drawings, they aren't just art. You see things other people miss." Willow looked down at her hands, stained slightly purple from the lily petals. "I see what's worth saving," she said, her voice tinged with a bitterness she couldn't quite hide. "Even if the rest of the world thinks it's just old dirt and weeds." The emotional arc of the night was reaching its first quiet peak. The martyr's burden Willow carried, the need to fix everything for everyone else while her own world crumbled, was heavy. But as she watched Yuna's breathing even out, the weight felt a little lighter. The girl's face was losing its frantic flush, replaced by a peaceful, natural glow. The fever was breaking. Yuna's small hand reached out, catching the edge of Willow's sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tiny but clear. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sound of it made Minjun close his eyes, a single shuddering breath escaping him. "She hasn't spoken like that in months?" Minjun murmured, more to himself than to Willow. "Not since." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. Willow saw the grief in the lines around his eyes, a mirror of the grief she felt for her family's lost legacy. For a moment, the billionaire in the denim shirt and the bankrupt artist in the farmhouse were just two souls seeking shelter from the same kind of rain. "Sleep now, Yuna," Willow said, tucking a stray hair behind the girl's ear. "The storm will be over by morning." As Yuna drifted into a deep, healing sleep, Minjun looked at Willow, his expression unreadable but profound. He didn't know yet that the woman saving his daughter was the woman whose life his company was about to dismantle. And Willow didn't know that the man she was protecting was the architect of her ruin. In the quiet of the kitchen, as the midnight lily worked its final magic, the seeds of a transformation were planted. One act of kindness had bridged the gap between a billionaire's empire and a healer's heart, and as the first light of a wet, gray dawn began to peek through the shutters, the world they both knew was already gone. The first light of dawn did not break over the savannah horizon so much as it seeped through the cracks in the shutters, a pale, watery gold that smelled of ozone and wet earth. The violent, earth-shaking roar of the hurricane had subsided into a rhythmic dripping from the eaves, a peaceful, persistent sound that filled the sudden silence of the farmhouse. Willow stirred in the velvet armchair where she had kept watch, her long braids slightly frayed and her neck stiff from the odd angle of her sleep. Her first instinct was to check the small figure on the daybed. Yuna was still fast asleep, but the terrifying, shallow panting of the night before had vanished. Her breathing was now deep and steady. Her small hands curled loosely over the edge of the quilt Willow's grandmother had stitched by hand. Willow leaned over and pressed the back of her hand to the girl's forehead. It was cool and soft. The fever had broken, chased away by the healing power of the midnight lily and a night of quiet sanctuary. A soft sound from the kitchen drew Willow's attention. She stood, her bare feet familiar with the floorboards that didn't creak, and walked toward the archway. She stopped short, the words of a greeting dying in her throat. The man standing in her kitchen was not the same man who had stumbled through her door in a soaked denim shirt. The weary, desperate stranger had been replaced by someone who looked like he commanded empires. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the rising sun, dressed in a crisp, charcoal gray suit that fit him with architectural precision. His dark hair, which had been matted and wild during the storm, was now swept back with effortless authority. He was looking out at the battered nursery, his profile sharp and unreadable. On the oak table, where Willow had spent the night crushing herbs and mixing tea, sat a sleek leather briefcase and a smartphone that was vibrating silently with a relentless stream of notifications. The transformation was so absolute that, for a moment, Willow felt like an intruder in her own home. "She's better," Willow whispered, her voice raspy from sleep and the lingering tension of the night. Minjun turned. The exhaustion was still there in the shadows beneath his eyes, but it was masked by a layer of polished steel. When he saw Willow, his expression softened just a fraction, enough to remind her of the man who had pleaded for his daughter's life, but not enough to hide the power he carried. "The fever is entirely gone," he said, his voice no longer a rasp, but a resonant, cultured baritone. "You saved her, Willow. I don't think there's a currency in the world that can properly settle a debt like that." "I didn't do it for a settlement," Willow said, moving toward the stove to start a pot of coffee. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness. She was acutely aware of her wrinkled tan shirt, her tired eyes, and the foreclosure notice that was still pinned to her front door, a jagged white tooth in the mouth of her home. Minjun watched her move. His gaze lingered on the botanical sketches pinned to the walls, the intricate, soulful renderings of the plants she had spent her life protecting. "I had a car arrive as soon as the main road was cleared," he said, checking a gold watch that likely cost more than her entire greenhouse. "My team is waiting at the end of the drive. But before I leave, there is something you should have." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored business card. He laid it on the table between them. Willow picked it up. The gold-embossed letters seemed to burn into her palm, Park Min-jun, Chairman and CEO, Park Global Tech. The name hit her like a physical blow. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Park Global Tech. They weren't just developers. They were the conglomerate currently swallowing the historic district of Savannah whole. They were the ones who had signed the papers to bulldoze her nursery to make room for a smart grid corporate campus. She looked up at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The man she had sheltered, the man whose child she had healed with her family's most sacred secret, was the very architect of her ruin. You, she breathed, her voice trembling. The Tech Hub project, the rezoning of the heritage lands. That's your company. Min-jun's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. He stepped toward her, but Willow instinctively backed away, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. Willow, I oversee hundreds of global initiatives. I don't personally manage the land clearing for every regional site, he began, his voice dropping into a professional, de-escalating tone that only made her anger flare hotter. It's not a site to me, Willow snapped. It's 3 generations of Montgomery history. It's the ground my grandfather died on. It's where the midnight lily grows. A plant you'll never find anywhere else in the world. And you were going to turn it into a parking lot without ever even looking at what was being destroyed. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Outside, the low rumble of an engine grew louder as a black SUV pulled into the muddy drive. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, their presence turning her sanctuary into a cold, corporate crime scene. Min-jun looked at the car, then back at Willow. He saw the fire in her eyes, the way she stood with her braids framing a face that was radiantly defiant even in her exhaustion. He looked at the card in her hand and then at the sketches of the plants she loved. For the first time, the Ice Emperor looked truly unsettled. He walked to the daybed and gently gathered the sleeping Yuna into his arms. The girl stirred, clinging to his neck, her pink jacket a bright pop of color against his somber suit. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Willow. I never forget a debt, Willow Montgomery, he said, his voice regaining its command, but with an underlying layer of something that sounded like a promise. And right now, I owe you everything. Do not worry about that notice on your door. Not yet. Before she could tell him that he couldn't buy his way out of this, the door clicked shut. Willow stood alone in the quiet kitchen, the business card still clutched in her hand. The storm had passed, but as she looked out at her battered nursery, she knew the real battle for the Montgomery legacy had only just begun. 3 days had passed since the hurricane had roared through Savannah, leaving behind a world that felt bruised and unfamiliar. Willow spent every daylight hour in the wreckage of her nursery, her long braids tied back with a piece of twine, her knees stained dark with the rich, muddy earth. She was moving with a frantic, desperate energy, trying to salvage what was left of the midnight lilies. The storm had been cruel, but the silence from the city was crueler. No more legal notices had arrived, yet the threat of the bulldozers hung over the property like a low, suffocating fog. She was kneeling in the damp soil of the north greenhouse, tenderly repotting a fractured cutting, when the familiar crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness. Willow didn't look up. She didn't need to. The air itself seemed to shift, vibrating with a high-voltage tension she had come to associate with only one person. The shadow that fell across her workbench was tall and steady. When she finally wiped her brow with the back of a dirt-streaked hand and stood, she found Min-jun watching her. He wasn't in the charcoal suit of a CEO today, nor the soaked denim of a victim. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater and dark trousers, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours. You're still here, he said softly. It wasn't a question. The Montgomerys don't leave just because the weather gets bad, Willow replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. She gestured to the surrounding devastation. I have lives to save here, Mr. Park. I assume you've come to tell me the demolition schedule has been moved up. Minjun stepped further into the greenhouse, his eyes scanning the intricate sketches she had taped to the glass walls. Studies of root systems, the geometry of petals, and the way light filtered through leaves. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from a drawing of a willow branch. "I spent the last 3 days looking into you, Willow," he confessed, turning back to her. "Not just your property or your tax records. I looked at your work, your research into urban biophilia, the way you've used these plants to treat everything from respiratory issues to trauma in this community." He moved to the center of the greenhouse and laid a large, heavy roll of architectural vellum on the potting table. He unfurled it, and Willow found herself looking at the blueprints for the Park Global Tech Hub, the very building that was supposed to replace her home. But the plans had changed. A massive, hollowed-out section at the heart of the glass skyscraper was circled in bold red ink. "My board of directors wants a cold, efficient monument to the future," Minjun said, his voice dropping into that resonant baritone. "They want steel and silicon. But my daughter, she hasn't stopped talking about the lady with the blue tea. She told me that the building will be lonely without the flowers." He looked at Willow with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I realized she's right. My company builds the tools of the future, but we've forgotten the people who have to live in it. I'm starting a new initiative. I'm calling it the Sanctuary Project." He tapped the red circle on the blueprint. "I want to build a 3-story, climate-controlled healing garden in the center of the city hub. I want it to be a place where my employees and the public can come to breathe, to heal, to reconnect with the earth. I have the best architects in the world, Willow, but they don't know the language of the soil. They don't know how to make a plant talk to the body, as you put it." He paused, the weight of the moment hanging between them. "I want you to lead it. I want you to be the director of botanical heritage for the Sanctuary Project. You'll have a multi-million-dollar budget, a full staff, and the authority to bring every rare species from this nursery into the heart of the city where they will be protected forever." Willow felt the martyr's burden she had carried for so long begin to creak under the sheer scale of the offer. This was everything she had ever dreamed of, the chance to take her family's wisdom and plant it on a stage the whole world would see. But the price was her home. "And the nursery?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The ground my grandfather tilled?" Minjun's expression was somber. "The hub still has to be built, Willow. The contracts are signed, and the infrastructure is already moving. I can't stop the change, but I can change what the future looks like. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a legacy that won't fit on this 1 acre of land." He stepped closer, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain clinging to him. "Yuna is waiting in the car. She refused to come inside because she was afraid you'd still be angry. She's different since that night. She's calmer. She's hopeful. You did that with a cup of tea and a bit of kindness. Imagine what you could do for a whole city." Willow looked around her battered greenhouse. She saw the cracks in the glass, the rot in the wooden beams, and the foreclosure notice that was still mocking her from the front gate. She realized that by clutching so tightly to the past, she was letting the future wither. Her armor of rage and fear had kept her safe, but it had also kept her small. "You're a very persuasive man, Mr. Park," she said, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I'm a man trying to pay a debt that can't be measured in dollars," he replied. Willow looked at the blueprint again, imagining her midnight lilies blooming 300 feet in the air, their indigo petals catching the city lights. She thought of Yuna's wide, apprehensive eyes and the way the girl had looked at her like she was a miracle. "I'll do it," Willow said, her voice gaining strength. "But on one condition. The Montgomery name stays on the garden. And we move the soil from this nursery, every bucket of it, to the new site. I won't have my ancestors' work paved over." A slow, rare smile spread across Minjun's face, transforming him from a distant emperor into something much more human and much more dangerous to her heart. He extended a hand, and when Willow took it, her skin dark and earthy against his pale, clean palm, the spark was instantaneous. "Deal," he said. As they walked out of the greenhouse toward the idling SUV, Willow saw a small, dark-haired girl press her face against the window, her wide-eyed apprehension melting into a radiant grin. The storm had taken Willow's past, but as she looked at Min-jun, she realized she might have just found a way to grow something much more beautiful in its place. The construction site of the Park Global Tech Hub was a world of screaming metal and cold shadows, a skeletal giant of steel rising from the red clay of Savannah. It was an environment designed for efficiency and speed, yet right in its center, Willow Montgomery had carved out a pocket of impossible peace. A temporary glass greenhouse had been erected to house the ancestral soil and the first migration of plants from the nursery. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the green, living breath of things that grew in the dark. Willow knelt on a burlap mat, her long braids draped over one shoulder as she worked with a tray of heirloom seeds. Beside her, Eunice sat in a small wooden chair, her pink hooded jacket replaced by a tiny denim apron Willow had found for her. The little girl remained a silent observer, her wide, apprehensive eyes following Willow's every movement. She was like a delicate sprout that had been kept in the shade too long, still alive, but too afraid to reach for the light. "The language of flowers isn't spoken with the tongue, Una," Willow said softly, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the glass walls. "It's a secret code that people used to use when their hearts were too full to find the right words. My grandmother taught it to me when I was just your age." She picked up a small, teardrop-shaped seed and held it out in her palm. "Each plant has a meaning. It's like they carry a message from the earth to the person who holds them." Willow reached into a wooden box and pulled out a packet of rosemary seeds. "This is rosemary. It stands for remembrance. We plant this when we want to tell someone that they are still with us, even if we can't see them anymore." She nudged the tray toward Una. "Do you want to help me give this one a home?" Una hesitated, her small hand hovering over the tray. She looked at the rosemary seeds, then up at Willow. With a slow, deliberate motion, she took a pinch of the seeds and pressed them into the dark, rich soil. "That's it," Willow encouraged, a warm smile touching her lips. "You're a natural. You have the Montgomery touch. You treat the soil like it's a living thing, and that's why the plants will trust you." They worked in silence for a long time, the only sound the distant clanging of the construction crews and the soft thwack of soil being leveled. Willow introduced her to lavender for devotion and sweet alyssum for worth beyond beauty. She watched as Una began to relax, her small shoulders dropping, her movements becoming more fluid as she felt the cool, grounding texture of the earth between her fingers. Willow knew that Una's silence wasn't just about grief. It was a fortress. The girl had watched her world shatter when her mother died, and she had decided that if she didn't speak, nothing else could be taken from her. She was protecting herself with a wall of quiet, much like Willow protected herself with her armor of independence. "There's one more I want to show you today," Willow said, pulling out a packet of zinnias. She looked at the colorful illustration on the front, bright, resilient blooms in shades of orange, pink, and red. "These are zinnias. In the language of flowers, they stand for thoughts of absent friends. They're the bravest flowers in the garden because they bloom even when the sun is too hot and the rain is too heavy." She held out a single zinnia seed to Una. "This one is special. It's for someone you miss very much. Someone you want to talk to, even if they can't answer back right now." Una's breath hitched. She stared at the tiny seed in Willow's dark palm. For a moment, the apprehension returned to her eyes, a flickering shadow of the pain she carried every day. She looked at the soil, then back at the seed, her lower lip trembling almost imperceptibly. Willow didn't push. She simply waited, her hands steady, providing the same patient sanctuary she gave to her most fragile seedlings. She knew that some things couldn't be forced. They had to bloom in their own time. Slowly, Yuna reached out. Her small, pale fingers brushed against Willow's palm as she took the zinnia seed. She didn't plant it immediately. Instead, she held it close to her chest, her eyes closing as she seemed to whisper something into the palm of her hand. Across the greenhouse, standing in the shadows of the entrance, Minjun watched them. He had been there for 20 minutes, his charcoal suit jacket draped over his arm, his usual mask of CEO authority completely gone. He saw the way Willow looked at his daughter, not with pity, but with a fierce, nurturing respect. He saw his daughter doing something he hadn't been able to make her do in over a year. She was connecting. Yuna opened her eyes and looked at the hole she had prepared in the soil. She placed the zinnia seed inside with a reverence that made Willow's chest ache. "Amma," Yuna whispered. The word was tiny, barely a breath, but in the quiet of the greenhouse, it sounded like a thunderclap. Willow froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the first word she had heard the girl speak. A Korean word for mother, filled with a year's worth of unspoken longing. Willow didn't make a scene. She didn't gasp or call out to Minjun. She simply leaned in and placed her hand gently over Yuna's, helping her cover the seed with a thin blanket of earth. "She hears you, Yuna," Willow said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every time that flower grows, it's going to be her way of saying she's still here, watching you bloom." Yuna looked up at Willow, and for the first time, a small, genuine light flickered in her eyes. It wasn't a full smile yet, but it was the promise of one. She leaned her head against Willow's shoulder, a gesture of trust that felt more valuable to Willow than any multimillion-dollar budget Minjun could ever provide. Minjun stepped out of the shadows, his footsteps heavy on the gravel floor. He walked over to them and knelt in the dirt, regardless of what it did to his expensive trousers. He looked at the tray of seeds, then at his daughter and finally at Willow. The gratitude in his eyes was so intense that Willow had to look away, her own armor feeling dangerously thin. "She spoke," Minjun murmured, his voice cracking. "She found the right flower," Willow replied, her long braids brushing against the soil as she stood. "Sometimes, you just have to give a soul the right language to use." Minjun stood and reached out, his hand hesitating before he gently touched Willow's arm. The contact was brief, but it hummed with the same electric connection they had felt at the nursery. In that moment, surrounded by the skeletal steel of the future and the ancient soil of the past, the bridge between their two worlds became more than just a contract. It became a living thing, rooted in a language that didn't need a single word of English or Korean to be understood. As they walked out of the greenhouse together, Yuna holding Willow's hand on one side and her father's on the other, the sanctuary project truly began. It wasn't just a garden they were building in the heart of the city. It was a home for the things that had been lost, and a promise that even in a world of glass and steel, the heart could still find a way to speak. The transition from the damp, fragrant earth of the greenhouse to the cold, crystalline air of the Park Global Gala felt like stepping onto another planet. Willow stood before the full-length mirror in her temporary suite, her breath catching as she took in the woman looking back at her. Her long, dark braids had been intricately coiled into a regal crown, adorned with tiny, hand-painted porcelain lilies that shimmered under the recessed lighting. She wore a floor-length gown of deep emerald silk that draped over her curves like moss on a riverbank, the color a deliberate homage to the heritage she was fighting to carry into the future. She looked like a queen, but as she smoothed the fabric over her hips, she felt the familiar weight of the martyr's burden. She wasn't here as a guest. She was the face of a multimillion-dollar gamble that Minjun's board of directors viewed with open hostility. To them, she wasn't a healer or an artist. She was an expensive line item in a budget that didn't show an immediate return on investment. When she stepped into the grand ballroom of the Savannah Hyatt, the sensory overload was immediate. The room was a shimmering sea of black tuxedos and sharp, icy diamonds. The air smelled of expensive scotch and the kind of perfume that cost more than Willow's monthly mortgage. In the center of the room, surrounded by a phalanx of men in gray suits, was Min-jun. He looked every bit the Ice Emperor. His posture impeccable, his expression a mask of polite but distant authority. But the moment his gaze found hers across the crowded room, the mask cracked. For a heartbeat, the billionaire CEO vanished, and the man who had sat in her kitchen while his daughter slept was the only one left. He broke away from his circle of advisors, moving toward her with a purpose that turned heads and sent a ripple of whispers through the crowd. "You look breathtaking, Willow," he murmured, his voice low enough to be private in the midst of the noise. He reached out, his hand settling at the small of her back, a gesture that was both protective and a public declaration of her importance. "I feel like a transplant in the wrong soil," Willow admitted, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "Then we'll make sure the soil adapts to you," Min-jun replied, his eyes dark with an admiration that made her skin hum. But the peace didn't last. As Min-jun was pulled away by a frantic lead developer, Willow found herself cornered near the champagne tower by three men who radiated a predatory, polished energy. At the center was Robert Chun, a senior board member whose family had been a rival to the Parks for generations. He looked at Willow's emerald dress with a smirk that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Ah, the botanical director," Chun said, his tone dripping with a condescension that made Willow's armor snap into place. "I've seen the projections for your sanctuary project. It's a lovely sentiment, Miss Montgomery, but this is a tech hub, not a community garden. My colleagues and I were just wondering how exactly a patch of weeds justifies a 30% increase in the infrastructure budget." Willow straightened her shoulders, her braids catching the light of the chandeliers. She didn't look at the champagne. She looked directly into Chun's eyes. "It's not a patch of weeds, Mr. Chun," she said, her voice carrying that rhythmic, soulful weight. "It's a life support system. Your cold, efficient monument is designed for machines, but you're asking humans to work in it. Humans who are stressed, burnt out, and disconnected. My weeds are the only thing in that building that will actually help them breathe." Chun let out a sharp, dry laugh. "Breath doesn't pay dividends. We are here to build the future of silicon, not to play in the dirt with a woman from a bankrupt nursery." The insult was sharp, designed to draw blood, but Willow didn't flinch. She thought of Yuna's first word in the greenhouse. She thought of her grandfather's hands in the savannah soil. "You call it dirt," Willow said, her voice dropping to a level that forced the men to lean in. "But that dirt saved the life of your CEO's daughter when your world-class medicine couldn't. You can build your towers as high as you want, but if you don't give them a heart, they're just expensive gravestones. The sanctuary project isn't a cost. It's an insurance policy for the souls of every person in your employ." A sudden silence fell over the immediate circle. Min-jun had returned, standing just behind Willow, his presence a cold, looming weight. He had heard every word. "Is there a problem here, Robert?" Min-jun asked, his voice like a blade of ice. Chun's smirk faltered. "Just a spirited debate about the allocation of resources, Min-jun. I'm sure Miss Montgomery understands the realities of corporate finance." "Miss Montgomery understands the realities of life," Min-jun countered, his hand returning to Willow's waist, pulling her slightly closer. "And as for the budget, if you find the 30% increase unacceptable, I invite you to present a plan to the board that explains why our employees' mental health is worth less than the gold plating on your executive elevator. Otherwise, I suggest you enjoy the scallops." Chun flushed a deep, angry red, gave a curt nod, and retreated into the crowd with his followers. Willow let out a long, shaky breath, her fingers trembling as she reached for a glass of sparkling water. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," Min-jun replied, turning her to face him. He didn't care who was watching. "They see you as an outsider, Willow. They don't understand that you are the most vital part of this entire company." Without your vision, the tech hub is just a hollow box. He led her away from the center of the ballroom toward a small, private balcony that overlooked the darkened Savannah River. The humidity of the night pressed against them, a familiar, heavy embrace that made the gala feel like a distant dream. "I'm not like them, Minjun," Willow said, looking out at the water. "I don't know how to navigate this world of sharks and shadows. I'm just a woman who knows how to make things grow." Minjun stepped into her space, the scent of sandalwood and power surrounding her. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "That's exactly why I need you. You're the only person in my life who isn't trying to take something from me. You're the only one who gives." In the quiet of the balcony, away from the glass and the gold, the Ice Emperor looked at her with a vulnerability that broke her heart. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, and for a moment, the two different worlds they inhabited finally bled into one. "The sanctuary project isn't just for the city, Willow," he murmured against her skin. "It's for me, because when I'm with you, I can finally breathe too." As the music from the ballroom drifted out to them, a soulful melody that spoke of longing and legacy, Willow realized that the battle with the sharks had only just begun. But as she felt Minjun's hand tighten around hers, she knew she wasn't fighting alone. The botanical artist from Harlem and the billionaire from Seoul were rooted together now, and no amount of corporate coldness could stop the bloom that was coming. The honeymoon period of the sanctuary project felt like a dream cultivated in the finest silt. But like any plant grown too fast in a greenhouse, it was fragile. Willow had spent the last week in a whirlwind of architectural meetings and soil analysis, her long braids now often tucked under a hard hat as she walked the glass and steel skeleton of what would become her legacy. Minjun was a constant presence, a silent anchor in the chaotic sea of contractors and board members. When he looked at her, the Ice Emperor melted, and Willow had finally begun to let down the heavy armor she had worn since her restaurant failed and her nursery fell into ruin. She truly believed they were building something that bridged their two worlds. She had even started to see the tech hub not as a monster swallowing her history, but as a trellis that would allow her family's wisdom to climb toward the clouds. The morning of the betrayal began with a deceptively peaceful sun. Willow had arrived early at the Park Global Executive offices to drop off the final irrigation schematics for the Midnight Lily tier. The floor was quiet, the scent of expensive floor wax and stale coffee hanging in the air. Minjun was in a closed-door session with the overseas investors, but his assistant had waved Willow toward his private office to wait. "He'll want to see those immediately," the assistant had said with a knowing smile. "He doesn't make a move on the hub without your approval anymore." Willow felt a warm flush of pride as she stepped into the sanctuary of Minjun's office. It was a room of glass and dark mahogany, overlooking the very city she was helping to transform. She set her leather portfolio on the sprawling desk, but as she did, her sleeve caught the edge of a thick, blue-bound folder labeled Project Phoenix. Phase 2 Final Execution. It was the internal name for the tech hub development. Curiosity, fueled by the new sense of partnership she felt, made her open it. She expected to see more blueprints of the garden or perhaps a schedule for the grand opening. Instead, her breath hitched, and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. Pinned to the first page was a site map of her family's nursery in Savannah. But it wasn't the map of a botanical sanctuary. It was a demolition grid. Every inch of the property, the ground where her grandfather's ashes were scattered, the foundation of the farmhouse, and the ancient mother root of the midnight lilies, was marked with a jagged red X. Willow's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her eyes raced across the legal addendum attached to the map. Botanical assets successfully liquidated and relocated to Tech Hub. Final site clearance authorized for total leveling. Date of execution: tomorrow. At the bottom of the page was the signature that shattered her world. It was bold, elegant, and unmistakable. Minjun's signature. Beside it was a private memo addressed to Robert Chun and the board. Risk mitigated. Willow Montgomery has been secured as director. PR optics are stabilized. Proceed with the complete removal of the Savannah structure to stay on schedule for the satellite uplink tower. The folder felt like it was burning her skin. She wasn't a partner. She wasn't a healer. She was a mitigated risk. The sanctuary project wasn't a bridge. It was a gilded cage designed to keep her busy while they bulldozed the very soul of her heritage. He had bought her silence with a fancy title and a multimillion-dollar budget, using her love for Yuna as the ultimate anchor to keep her in place. The $32.18 miracle had been a lie. Willow! She spun around, the folder still clutched in her trembling hands. Minjun stood in the doorway, his charcoal jacket off, his sleeves rolled up. He looked relaxed, a soft smile starting to form on his lips, until he saw the folder, until he saw the look in her eyes. "You're clearing it?" Willow whispered, her voice cracking with a pain so deep it felt physical. "Total leveling. You're killing the mother root. You're paving over my grandfather's ghost." Minjun's face went pale, his jaw tightening as he stepped into the room. "Willow, listen to me. The satellite tower is a structural necessity for the hub's connectivity. I tried to move it, but the bedrock only supports that specific location. We've moved the soil, we've moved the plants. You didn't move the home." Willow cried, the martyr's burden returning with a vengeful weight. "You didn't move the memories. You told me we were saving it. You told me my legacy wouldn't fit on 1 acre. But what you meant was that you didn't have room for my humanity in your world of steel. I am trying to give you a bigger stage, a world where you never have to worry about $32.18 again," Minjun argued, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. The nursery was a failing business on a dying piece of land. Here you are a director. You are powerful. I was powerful when I was standing in the mud with nothing but my integrity," Willow said, her braids swaying as she shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "Here, I'm just a decoration. I'm the black lady you hired to make your corporate takeover look like a fairy tale. You used me, Minjun. You used my kindness. And you used your daughter's silence to get what you wanted." The mention of Yuna made Minjun flinch as if she had struck him. "That's not true. My feelings for you, the way Yuna has opened up, that has nothing to do with the contracts. It has everything to do with them." Willow shoved the folder across the desk, the papers scattering like dead leaves. "Because you knew. Every time you kissed me, every time you watched me plant seeds with your daughter, you knew that tomorrow you were sending in the machines to erase my life. You're not the man in the blue denim shirt. You're the man in the suit, and you're just as cold as the glass in this building." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't want to hear his logic or his mitigation strategies. She turned and ran, her emerald silk scarf trailing behind her like a streak of forest fire through the sterile gray hallway. She ignored his calls. She ignored the security guards. She burst out of the glass doors and into the humid Savannah heat, the air finally feeling real against her skin. She didn't take the corporate car. She walked until her feet ached, until the skyscrapers of Minjun's empire were nothing but shadows on the horizon. She took the bus back to the outskirts of the city, back to the gravel road where her life began. By the time she reached the gate of the Montgomery nursery, the sun was setting, casting long, bleeding shadows over the battered greenhouses. She sank to her knees in the dirt, the real dirt, not the ancestral soil she had carefully packed into plastic crates for the tech hub. She dug her fingers into the earth, feeling the cool, damp reality of it. She had betrayed them. She had let the wolf in because he looked like he was hurting. The biggest moment of tension wasn't the storm or the gala. It was this, the realization that her kindness had been the key that unlocked her own destruction. She looked at her hands, still clean from her days in the executive offices, and felt a wave of revulsion. Tomorrow the machines would come. Tomorrow the phoenix would rise, and Willow Montgomery would be nothing but a footnote in a corporate annual report. She felt used, discarded, and utterly alone. As the stars began to peek through the canopy of the ancient oaks, Willow didn't pray for a miracle. She didn't wait for a billionaire to save her. She simply held onto the earth, her tears watering the ground one last time, preparing for the transformation that only comes when everything else has been burned away. The air in the Park Global boardroom was pressurized, a sterile vacuum where the scent of high-grade ozone and cold espresso replaced the humid, earthy perfume of the savanna marshes. Min-jun stood at the head of the polished obsidian table, his charcoal suit jacket buttoned, his face a mask of such frigid, absolute authority that even the most seasoned board members held their breath. On the massive digital displays lining the walls, a live feed from the Montgomery nursery flickered. A row of yellow excavators stood poised like mechanical predators at the edge of the ancient oak canopy, their engines idling in a low, hungry growl. Robert Chun sat at the far end of the table, a tablet in his hand and a look of triumphant malice in his eyes. The site is cleared of all legal occupants, Chairman. The demolition crew is awaiting the final authorization code to commence Phase 2. We are currently 6 minutes ahead of the satellite uplink window. Min-jun didn't look at the screen. He was looking at a small, crumpled piece of paper he had found on his desk that morning. A drawing Yuna had made of a zinnia, colored with a shaky hand but filled with a vibrant, defiant life. He thought of Willow kneeling in the dirt, her long braids swaying as she told his daughter that the language of flowers was a secret code for the heart. He realized that by destroying the nursery, he wasn't just clearing land. He was silencing the only voice that had managed to bring his child back from the shadows. "Abort the demolition," Min-jun said. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like the building itself had stopped breathing. Robert Chun's smirk didn't disappear. It simply froze. "I'm sorry, Chairman?" Chun asked, his voice dripping with forced patience. "Perhaps I misheard. The satellite tower is the cornerstone of the entire hub. Without that specific bedrock location, the global connectivity contract is void. We are talking about a $12 billion valuation shift." "Abort the demolition," Min-jun repeated, his voice dropping into that terrifying, resonant baritone. He looked around the table, his gaze a blade of ice that cut through the calculations of the men in gray suits. The Montgomery nursery is no longer a part of the demolition grid. It is to be designated as a protected cultural and botanical heritage site. Permanently. "You can't do that," Chun snapped, his polished facade finally cracking as he stood up, his chair screeching against the glass floor. "The board has already ratified the site plan. You are a majority shareholder, Min-jun, but you are not a god. If you halt this project now, for a patch of weeds and a woman who has clearly compromised your judgment, we will call for a vote of no confidence before the market closes. You will lose your chair. You will lose your company." Min-jun walked slowly toward Chun, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like the man in the blue denim shirt who had been willing to beg a stranger for his daughter's life. "You think this company is my legacy, Robert?" Min-jun asked, leaning over the table. "This building is glass and steel, can be shattered, can be replaced. But the soil Willow Montgomery stands on carries the breath of 3 generations. It carried my daughter's first words in a year. You tell me about valuation shifts, but you don't know the value of a single soul." Min-jun reached for the master console in the center of the table. His hand hovered over the biometric scanner. "Chairman, think about the investors," another board member pleaded, his voice thin with panic. "Think about the Phoenix Initiative." "I am thinking about the Phoenix," Min-jun replied, his eyes fixed on the live feed where he could see a small, lone figure in an emerald silk scarf standing defiantly in front of the lead excavator. "A phoenix only rises when the old world is burned away. Maybe it's time for the old way of doing business to burn." He pressed his palm to the scanner. The screen flashed a deep, authoritative red. Command override. Project Phoenix Phase 2 suspended. All units stand down. On the screen, the yellow excavators let out a final, dying puff of smoke as their engines were remotely cut. The foreman at the site looked up at his headset in confusion, then signaled to his men. The mechanical predators began to back away, their heavy treads churning the mud as they retreated from the Montgomery gate. Minjun watched as Willow, who had been braced for the end, slowly lowered her head, her braids falling over her shoulders as her body shook with a sob of relief. She looked so small against the backdrop of the ancient oaks, and yet, in that moment, she was the most powerful thing he had ever seen. He turned back to the board, his posture impeccable, the Ice Emperor returning to his throne, but with a heart that was finally beating with a purpose. The vote of no confidence will be on my desk by 5 p.m., Minjun said, his voice a calm, steady rhythm. I welcome it, because if being the CEO of Park Global means I have to destroy the very things that make life worth living, then I don't want the chair. I'm going to Savannah. I have a debt to pay. He picked up Yuna's drawing and his suit jacket, walking out of the boardroom without a second glance at the billions of dollars he was leaving behind. He didn't hear Chun's shouting or the frantic calls of the advisors. All he heard was the memory of a low, melodic hum in a kitchen filled with the scent of lavender and earth. The martyr's burden Willow carried was no longer hers to bear alone. Minjun had finally realized that his armor wasn't the suit or the money. It was the bravery to choose kindness when the world demanded coldness. As he stepped into the elevator, the descent felt like a liberation. He was going back to the dirt. He was going back to the only woman who had ever looked at him and seen the man, not the empire. And as the elevator doors closed on the cold glass of the future, he knew that the real transformation was only just beginning. The victory over the bulldozers had brought a fleeting peace to the Montgomery nursery. But the air in Savannah soon grew heavy with a different kind of storm, one that didn't come with wind and rain, but with the silent, suffocating weight of centuries of tradition. Willow was in the south greenhouse, her long dark braids gathered into a low ponytail as she painstakingly cleaned the leaves of a recovering midnight lily. The nursery was officially a heritage site, a small island of green in a sea of rising steel. But Willow knew that a title on a piece of paper didn't mean she was safe. The sound of the gate wasn't the usual heavy crunch of the construction trucks. It was a soft, rhythmic click of heels on the gravel, a sound so precise and deliberate it seemed to command the very air to go still. Willow stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and felt a familiar chill settle in her chest. Standing at the entrance of the greenhouse was a woman who looked like she had been carved from a single block of flawless marble. Mrs. Park, Minjun's mother, was a vision of severe elegance. She wore a tailored suit of silk that was the color of a winter moon. Her silver hair pulled back into a knot so tight it looked painful. She didn't look like she belonged in the humidity of a Georgia marsh. She looked like she belonged on a throne in a world where softness was considered a terminal flaw. Beside her stood an assistant holding a parasol, shielding her from the southern sun as if the light itself were an insult. Mrs. Park didn't speak immediately. She simply let her gaze travel over the rusted frames of the greenhouse, the muddy floors, and finally, Willow herself. She looked at Willow's tan shirt and the dirt under her fingernails with a clinical detachment that felt more cutting than any shouted insult. So, Mrs. Park said, her voice a thin, sharp reed of a sound. This is the sanctuary that has cost my son his seat on the board of the largest tech conglomerate in Asia. Willow felt her armor of independence lock into place. She straightened her shoulders, meeting the older woman's icy stare with a quiet, rooted dignity. It's a home, Mrs. Park, and it's the place that saved your granddaughter's life. Mrs. Park stepped into the greenhouse, her silk heels clicking on the damp floorboards. She reached out with a gloved hand and touched a leaf, then pulled back as if she had touched something diseased. My granddaughter is a Park. She is a descendant of kings and pioneers of industry. She was never meant to be healed by weeds and folklore. She was meant to be healed by the finest minds money can buy. The finest minds couldn't get her to speak, Willow countered softly, her voice carrying the soulful weight of her ancestors. The dirt did. The plants did. Because they don't care about lineage, Mrs. Park. They only care about care. Mrs. Park turned, her eyes narrowing. Do not mistake a moment of vulnerability for a change in destiny, Miss Montgomery. My son is a man of duty. He has been raised to lead, to marry within his station, and to preserve a legacy that is 500 years old. You are a botanical artist with a bankrupt business and a bank account that wouldn't cover the cost of the tea we serve at our family table. You are a distraction. A beautiful one, perhaps, but a distraction nonetheless. She walked toward Willow, the scent of expensive, cold lilies following her. I have spent 40 years ensuring that the park name remains untarnished. I did not survive the corporate wars of soul to see my only son throw it all away for a miracle in a swamp. You think you have changed him? You have only delayed the inevitable. Eventually, the suit will feel too tight, the humidity will become unbearable, and he will realize that he has no place in a world that smells of fertilizer and struggle. The martyr's burden Willow carried flared up, a hot coal of doubt in her stomach. Every word Mrs. Park spoke echoed the fears Willow had been whispering to herself in the dark. Was she just a temporary refuge? Was she holding on to a man who belonged to the stars while she was rooted in the mud? I'm not holding on to him, Willow said, her voice trembling slightly. He's holding on to me. And maybe he's doing that because for the first time in his life, he doesn't have to be a chairman. He can just be a father. He can just be a man. Mrs. Park let out a sharp, dry laugh that lacked any mirth. A man is what his responsibilities make him. Without his empire, Minjun is a ghost. And Yuna needs a mother who can navigate the high courts of the world, not a woman who spends her days talking to flowers. She reached into her small, beaded handbag and pulled out a single heavy envelope. She laid it on the potting table next to the midnight lily. There is enough in that envelope to buy 10 of these nurseries. More than enough to ensure your brother's education and your grandmother's comfort for the rest of her life. All I ask is that you realize your fitness for this family is non-existent. Walk away now while he still has a shred of his reputation left. Let him return to Seoul. Let him be the king he was born to be. Willow looked at the envelope. It was the same choice she had faced with the foreclosure, the choice between survival and her soul. She looked at her hands, the dark skin stained with the soil of her heritage, and then she looked at the doorway. Yuna was standing there. The little girl had been hiding behind the hibiscus plants, her pink jacket a bright splash against the greenery. Her eyes were wide, and for the first time they weren't just apprehensive, they were fierce. She didn't look at her grandmother with the reverence Mrs. Park clearly expected. She looked at her with a defiance that was a perfect mirror of Willow's own. "Grandmother," Yuna said, her voice small but remarkably clear. Mrs. Park froze, her hand flying to her throat. It was the first time she had heard her granddaughter speak since the funeral in Seoul. "Yuna, my blossom, you spoke." Yuna walked past her grandmother, her small shoes stepping firmly on the muddy floor. She went straight to Willow and took her hand, her small fingers interlacing with Willow's dirt-streaked ones. "Willow stays," Yuna said, looking directly into the matriarch's eyes. "Willow is the language." The silence that followed was heavy with a transformation that Mrs. Park couldn't control with money or status. The language of flowers had become a bridge that even the sharpest corporate blade couldn't cut. Mrs. Park looked at the joined hands of the black botanical artist and the Korean heiress. She saw the bloom in Yuna's cheeks and the strength in Willow's posture. For a heartbeat, the Ice Queen looked old. She looked like a woman who had spent her whole life building walls, only to find that the garden had grown over them. She didn't take the envelope back. She simply gave a curt, stiff nod, her eyes lingering on Yuna with a mix of shock and a strange, buried longing. We shall see, Yuna. We shall see if a garden can survive a winter. She turned and walked out of the greenhouse, her heels clicking a much slower, more contemplative rhythm on the gravel. The parasol followed her, but the shadow she left behind felt less like a threat and more like a challenge. Willow sank onto her stool, the breath rushing out of her. Yuna climbed into her lap, resting her head against Willow's shoulder. The martyr's burden was still there, but it was being shared now. Minjun arrived minutes later, his face frantic as he saw his mother's car disappearing down the drive. He burst into the greenhouse, his charcoal jacket discarded, his tie loose. He saw Willow and Yuna sitting together in the dirt, the white envelope sitting untouched on the table. He didn't ask what was said. He didn't have to. He walked over and knelt in front of them, his hands covering theirs. He looked at Willow, and in his eyes, she saw a man who had finally stopped running from his destiny and started growing his own. She tried to buy the sun, didn't she? Minjun whispered, his forehead resting against Willow's. She tried, Willow said, her braids brushing his cheek. But she forgot that the sun doesn't belong to anyone. It just gives. As the golden savanna light filtered through the glass, warming the three of them, Willow realized the winter Mrs. Park promised would come. The corporate world would strike back, and the cultural shadows would deepen. But as she felt Yuna's heartbeat against hers and Miho's strength surrounding them, she knew that they weren't just a family of circumstance. They were a family of choice. And in the Montgomery nursery, that was the only kind of fitness that ever truly mattered. The air in the Park Global Tech Hub had finally begun to breathe. The massive glass atrium was filled with the rhythmic hum of the irrigation systems Willow had designed, and the first tier of the healing garden was a lush, vibrant green that defied the cold steel surrounding it. But as the plants took root, the shadows in the executive wings grew longer. Willow felt the shift in the atmosphere before she saw it. A cold, clinical sharpness that replaced the warm curiosity of the staff. She was in her rooftop laboratory, her long dark braids pulled back as she documented the growth cycles of the transplanted midnight lilies. The laboratory was her sanctuary, a place where the logic of the earth met the precision of technology. She was finalizing the digital encryption for the Montgomery Protocol, the specific sequence of light and nutrient delivery that allowed the lilies to bloom in a controlled environment. When the door hissed open, it wasn't Minjun. It was a team of 4 men in sterile white lab coats, led by a woman with a face like a flint blade. Behind them stood Robert Chun, his hands clasped behind his back, a look of grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Willow Montgomery," the woman said, her voice a flat, digital drone. "I am Director Holloway from Internal Compliance. We have a warrant to seize all digital assets, research journals, and biological samples associated with the Sanctuary Project." Willow stood, her hand instinctively covering her leather-bound journal. "On what grounds?" "This research is part of the Heritage Agreement. The grounds of industrial espionage and intellectual property theft." Robert Chun stepped forward, his voice a smooth, oily purr. "It seems your Montgomery Protocol bears a 98% similarity to a proprietary sedative formula currently under development at Park Global's pharmaceutical division. A formula that was accessed from the chairman's private server 3 nights ago using your biometric credentials." The world seemed to tilt. Willow looked at her hands, the hands that had spent a lifetime nurturing life, now being accused of stealing it. "That's impossible. My research is based on my grandfather's journals. It's ancestral knowledge, not corporate data." "The logs don't lie, Miss Montgomery," Holloway said, gesturing for her team to begin dismantling the workstation. 2 gigabytes of encrypted pharmaceutical data were uploaded from this terminal to an offshore server in the Cayman Islands. A server linked to a shell company in your brother's name. The martyr's burden Willow had carried for so long returned with a crushing, suffocating weight. She felt the old rage, the familiar bitterness of being the outsider who was only ever tolerated as long as she was useful. She thought of Marcus, her brother, and the way his eyes had shone when Minjun offered to pay for his tuition. They were using her family as a weapon against her. "I didn't do this," Willow said, her voice trembling but clear. "And you know I didn't, Robert. You're trying to kill the garden because you couldn't kill the man." "I'm protecting the shareholders," Chun replied, checking his watch. "The board has already been notified. A formal complaint has been filed with the SEC. And since the chairman is currently in a deposition defending his own fitness to lead, he isn't here to save you this time." Willow was escorted out of the building, not as a director, but as a criminal. She walked through the atrium she had built, past the nodding heads of the lilies that were now technically stolen property. The eyes of the employees she had taught to breathe were now averted, filled with a mix of suspicion and pity. She didn't go to her lawyers. She didn't go back to the nursery. She went to the only place where the truth couldn't be encrypted. The small, hidden grove of ancient oaks on the edge of the Montgomery land. She sat in the dirt, her emerald scarf catching on the brambles, and felt the crisis of faith hollow her out. Did Minjun believe them? Had the Ice Emperor looked at the logs and seen a thief instead of a partner? She realized that her fear wasn't about losing the job or the money. It was the terrifying possibility that the bridge they had built was made of glass after all. The sun was beginning to set when a figure appeared at the edge of the grove. It wasn't the polished CEO in the charcoal suit. It was the man in the rumpled white shirt, his tie gone, his dark hair disheveled by the savannah wind. Minjun walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the fallen leaves. He didn't speak. He simply sat down in the dirt beside her, his expensive trousers ruined by the mud, and looked at the horizon. "They found the offshore account," Willow whispered, not looking at him. "They found the logs. It looks like I sold your secrets to the highest bidder." "I know what it looks like," Minjun said, his voice a low, steady rhythm. "Then why are you here?" Willow turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're the chairman of a global empire. You should be distance managing the fallout. You should be erasing me from the history of your company." Minjun reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm, a solid anchor in the storm of her doubt. "Because I know the language of the flowers, Willow, and I know the soul of the woman who taught it to me. A woman who gives her last bit of medicine to a stranger doesn't sell a soul for a Cayman bank account." He squeezed her hand, his eyes fixing on hers with an intensity that burned through her armor. "Robert Chun thinks I'm a man of logic. He thinks I'll follow the data, but he forgot that I'm a man who watched his daughter speak because of you. Logic didn't do that. Faith did. They'll destroy you for this," Willow said. "If you stand by me, they'll use it as proof that you've lost your mind. Then let them," Minjun replied, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. "I've spent my whole life being sensible and calculated, and I was dying inside that glass box. You gave me the air to breathe, Willow. Now, I'm going to give you the fire to fight back." He pulled a small silver drive from his pocket. "I've spent the last 6 hours with a team of independent forensic analysts I hired outside of the company. We didn't look at the logs. We looked at the timestamps of the biometric scans. The person who accessed the server was in the building, yes. But they used a recursive mirror of your signature. A signature that was captured during the gala 3 weeks ago." "Chun," Willow breathed. "Chun," Minjun confirmed. He was so focused on the digital trail that he forgot the physical one. The terminal he used was in the secondary archive, the one place in the building where the security cameras have a blind spot. But he forgot one thing. Minjun looked at the dirt on Willow's hands. "He forgot that I've been studying your work. I had sensors installed in the laboratory to monitor the oxygen output of the lilies. Those sensors don't just track air. They track movement and heat. At the exact moment the data was being stolen by you in the lab, the sensors recorded a complete lack of human thermal energy in the room. You weren't there, Willow. You were with Yuna in the garden." The weight on Willow's chest finally began to lift. The transformation she had been waiting for wasn't a miracle from the sky. It was the realization that she wasn't alone in the struggle. The martyr's burden was a lie she told herself to keep from trusting anyone else. "We go back tomorrow," Minjun said, standing up and pulling her to her feet. "But we don't go back to defend you. We go back to take the company from the sharks." Willow looked at the ancient oaks, their branches strong and unyielding against the darkening sky. She wasn't just a botanical artist anymore. She was a woman who had found a partner whose roots were as deep as her own. She adjusted her braids, her eyes flashing with a new, fierce light. "I'm ready," she said. As they walked out of the grove together, the crisis of faith hadn't broken Willow. It had forged her. The billionaire and the artist were no longer just bridging two worlds. They were preparing to build a new one where the truth was rooted in the heart, and where no amount of silicon or steel could ever overshadow the power of a single act of kindness. The morning of the grand opening did not begin with the cold, sterile hum of a corporation, but with the rhythmic, ancient song of the savanna marshes. A thick, silver mist clung to the ground as the first guests arrived at the park global tech hub. But as they stepped through the glass doors of the atrium, the city of steel vanished. They were greeted by a cathedral of green, a living, breathing sanctuary where the air was filtered through a million leaves and the silence was broken only by the soft trickle of a recycled water waterfall. Willow Montgomery stood at the top of the winding wooden staircase, her long dark braids cascading over a gown of shimmering white silk that looked like the petals of a lily. She didn't feel like a mitigated risk or a corporate decoration anymore. She felt like the bridge. Below her, the Montgomery Park Sanctuary stretched out in all its glory, a 3-story masterpiece where the red clay of her grandfather's nursery had been layered with the precision of Minjun's technology to create a self-sustaining paradise in the heart of the city. The martyr's burden that had defined her life for so long had finally been set down. She watched as people from all walks of life, tech executives in sharp suits and grandmothers from Harlem in their Sunday best, walked side by side through the rows of blooming midnight lilies. The indigo petals caught the morning light, glowing with a soft, ethereal radiance that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth. Yuna was at the center of it all. No longer the shivering girl in the pink hooded jacket. She wore a dress of traditional Korean silk, her eyes bright and vocal as she led a group of children through the language of flowers exhibit. She was the one explaining the meaning of the zinnias for remembrance and the rosemary for devotion. She had become the voice of the garden, the living proof that when you give a soul the right soil, it will always find a way to bloom. Willow felt a hand settle at the small of her back, a warm, solid presence that made her whole body relax. She didn't have to turn to know it was Minjun. He had traded his charcoal suit for a simple, elegant black hanbok jacket, a nod to his own heritage that mirrored Willow's embrace of hers. "We did it, Willow," he whispered, his voice a low, soulful vibration. "No," Willow replied, turning to look at him, her eyes shining with a peace she had never known. "The earth did it. We just finally learned how to listen." As the sun reached its zenith, casting a golden light through the glass dome of the atrium, the formal ceremony began. But it wasn't a ribbon-cutting or a speech about profit margins. Minjun led Willow to the very center of the garden, to a secluded grove where the mother root of the midnight lilies had been replanted in a bed of savanna soil and Korean granite. The crowd fell silent, the only sound the soft rustle of the leaves. Minjun didn't look at the cameras or the board members. He looked only at Willow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring that looked like it had been fashioned from a silver vine, a single, deep indigo diamond at its center that perfectly matched the color of the lilies. "Willow," Minjun said, his voice carrying through the atrium with a quiet, unshakable strength. "When you opened your door to me during that storm, you didn't just save my daughter. You saved me. You showed me that a life without kindness is just a hollow box, and that the only thing worth building is a home for the heart." He dropped to one knee in the rich, dark soil, the billionaire CEO surrendering to the beauty of the artist. In the language of flowers, the midnight lily stands for a love that thrives in the dark and finds its strength in the storm. I don't want to lead an empire without you. I want to grow a life with you. Willow Montgomery, will you be the heart of my family? Will you marry me? The silence that followed was thick with the weight of the transformation they had both undergone. Willow looked at the man who had traded his armor for vulnerability, and she felt the final pieces of her own rage and fear fall away. She thought of the $32.18 and the foreclosure notice, and she realized that every hardship had been a seed, and every tear had been the water that brought her to this moment. Yes, Willow breathed, her voice a rhythmic, soulful promise. 1,000 times, yes. As Minjun slipped the ring onto her finger, the atrium erupted in a sound that wasn't just applause, but a collective sigh of hope. Yuna ran to them, throwing her arms around both of them, her laughter the most beautiful music Willow had ever heard. Even Mrs. Park, standing at the edge of the crowd, offered a stiff but genuine nod of respect, a recognition that the fitness of a family was measured in love, not lineage. The Montgomery Park Sanctuary was officially open, but it was more than a botanical achievement. It was a monument to the bravery of kindness. As the three of them stood together among the flowers, the black botanical artist from Savannah and the billionaire from Seoul, they were no longer two different worlds trying to survive. They were one world, rooted in the same soil, reaching for the same sun, and finally, after the longest storm, they were home. The transformation was complete. The strange man and the black lady had rewritten the ending of their story, proving that when you let a stranger in from the storm, you might just find the very person who was meant to help you bloom. As the day faded into a soft, lavender twilight, the midnight lilies began to glow, their secret light illuminating the path for everyone who sought a moment of peace. And there, in the heart of the city of steel, the Montgomery Park Sanctuary stood as a promise. That kindness is never wasted, and that even the coldest heart can be healed by the language of flowers and the warmth of a door that was opened just in time.